Welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. This is the 36th webinar in our series, and our content has been viewed now in nearly 100 countries. We're really delighted to be having such a diverse community develop around our ongoing series. So as usual, we have a Google Doc for everybody to share notes and comments about today's topic, especially those of you tuning into the live stream chat. The URL will be showing up in the chat for those of you who want to participate in the shared note-taking, and we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, pose questions to us in the chat, and we will do our best as moderators to get the questions represented in our conversation here in the Google Hangout. So today we're really honored to be have a full house and to be joined by a great group of folks and have our featured speaker Henry Jenkins here with us this morning, focused on this question about participatory culture and what challenges we face to really fully realize this ideal, especially in regards to youth and civic and political participation. So as usual with our webinars, we'd like to start off by giving all of the folks in the Hangout an opportunity to introduce themselves, talk about their interest and involvement in the topic of today's conversation, before we turn it over to Henry, who will do a brief presentation. So let me invite our participants to introduce themselves. Andy, maybe you could start us off here.
Hi, I'm Andy Rehak. I'm a second-year PhD student in Indiana University's Learning Sciences program. I'm currently researching how digital badges can transform the way we recognize and credential learning. And also, I'm taking a course this semester about the interactions and learning that occur in participatory cultures. So I'm very excited to join the Google Hangout today.
Great, thanks, Andy. Jeannie, how about you next?
Hi, my name is Jeannie Crowley. I'm the manager of digital media and learning at Bank Street College of Education. We are solely focused on providing education-related degrees for graduate students, and part of my work here is to help faculty, both online and face-to-face, bring informal tools and technologies into the classroom. And one of our big pushes right now is to help the faculty model for the graduate students how they can survey and invite their students to bring their own out-of-school practices in, and then how they can then go into their own classrooms and do the same thing. So it's very much in line with the talk today, and I'm very excited.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeannie. Jen?
I'm Jennifer Earle from University of Arizona. I'm visiting Henry's team today. I just joined the YPP network related to MacArthur, and so I've been going around and visiting with each of the other campuses that are involved in that project. And today I'm fortunate enough to be here to visit with Henry's team, but also participate in this. So I'm very much looking forward to it.
Great. Thanks, Jen. Great to have you. Leanna.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leanna Gamber Thompson. I'm a postdoc here at USC. There's a little bit of an echo, so I'm a postdoc here at USC working with Henry and studying libertarian youth and how they engage with participatory politics and culture, and also how they engage in more institutional forms of politics. And I'm really excited to be part of the Google Hangout today.
Great. Thanks, Leanna. Myra? Oh, Myra, are you there?
Yes,
Oh,
sorry
yeah,
about that. It's phasing in and out. My name is Moria Orr, and I'm from Columbia. I work for the Center for Community Arts Education through media and technology. And to create core curriculum such as film. Expand that to turn around, sorry, middle school.
Great, thanks, Mauro. I think we may be having a little bit of a connectivity issue, but hopefully people caught your introduction. Okay, Netta?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Neta Kligler-Devenchik, and I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate at Annenberg School of Communication, working with Henry on the Media Activism and Participatory Politics project. And I'm leading a case study on fan communities that encourage civic and political engagement for young people.
Great, thanks, Netta. And Sangeeta, last but not least.
Right, my name is Sangeeta Shrestova. I'm actually the research director on Henry's project, Media Activism and Participatory Politics, and also Civic Past. Those are two parallel projects here at USC. Over the past 8 months or so, I've actually been focusing on Muslim American youth and their participatory practices, and I specifically focused on the ways in which storytelling and the climate of surveillance kind of come together to create a new mode of civic engagement for them in a post 9/11 climate in the United States.
Great, thanks, Sangeeta. So we're really delighted to have such a great group on the Hangout, and also to have Henry Jenkins leading our conversation today. I think in a lot of ways Henry needs no introduction, but a lot of folks who may know of Henry's work as one of the first scholars to really bring fan studies to broader awareness, and also for a tremendous amount of work he's done in children's media culture. Is that Henry's been increasingly engaged in research and hands-on engagement with media literacy, and more recently issues of civic and political participation, and the relationship between participatory politics, participatory culture, and participatory politics, as well as media literacy. So really trying to bridge the divides between some of our conversations that happen in media and technology studies and digital cultural studies and education, civic education and media literacy. So it's really been fantastic to have Henry as a colleague and for his leadership in this space, and you know, for bringing these diverse threads and conversations together in our unique community around digital media and learning and connected learning. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Henry to frame up some of our conversation today. Henry, I think you're muted, so we're not hearing you.
There we go. You're doing better. Okay. So anyway, thanks, Mimi. I'm really happy to be here today with such an interesting group of people. It's an incredibly rich moment to be thinking about youth participation and political participation, particularly after last week's election, where more young people voted than had voted 4 years before. We work really hard not to translate political participation into voting, but it nevertheless is exciting to see that connection get made. I've been looking at participatory culture as a concept now for going on 25 years. I first really coined the term for the book Textual Poachers, Television Fans, and Participatory Culture, which is just coming out this week with a 20th anniversary edition. And there I simply was trying to set up fans as participants in opposition to spectatorship, models in which we simply suck in messages, which were sort of dominant at the time. Through the years, I've deepened my understanding of the term, both in terms of cultural expression, in terms of informal learning, and I would say the white paper I wrote for the MacArthur Foundation about 6 years ago really reflects a pedagogical model of participation. But with the work I'm doing now with the Youth and Participatory Politics Network, I'm trying to return to a question that's plagued cultural studies, my field, for much of its history. That is, what's the connection between cultural participation and political participation? How do we understand what politics mean in a world where remix is more and more part of the everyday life of young people? And how does politics change in a world where we have an expectation that we don't simply consume both either culture or politics, but actively participate? So I'm going to shift so we can see my presentation, and hopefully that's showing up now, and walk through just a little bit some ideas I've been developing. Our team here has been developing. The MAP team, Media, Activism, and Participatory Politics, has been doing sort of case study examinations of exemplary networks and organizations that have been very effective at getting young people involved in the political process. So we have been looking, well, Sangeeta has been looking at Muslim Americans, Liana at Young Libertarians, Netta at fan activism more generally, with a focus on Harry Potter Alliance, Imagine Better, and Nerd Fighters, and Aurelie Zimmerman, who is focused on the DREAM Act. I'm going to try to provide a little bit of a framework for thinking about this work. The picture you see on the slide here is of Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote for The New Yorker a little over a year ago, a piece sort of critiquing the notion of Twitter revolutions, arguing that two things. One, that Twitter supports weak social ties, which encourage a fairly superficial level of engagement and a limited amount of risk. That's the heart of his argument. As we've looked at it, we see several core problems. First, we could look at this question of weak social ties or limited risk. And the work that Aurelie Zimmerman has done on the DREAM activist sort of suggests that, in fact, this is a network of young, undocumented immigrants who are working hard to change federal policy and to support educational rights and hopefully ultimately citizenship rights for their community. They have been worked against the digital divide. In many cases, what Aurelie found was these young activists had limited access to digital resources. They were relying on community centers and libraries. She was finding bloggers who didn't have their own computers, filmmakers who didn't have their own cameras. But working together, they had taken a fairly strong stand against current deportation policies of the Obama administration, often involving activities that engage with considerable risk. Minimally, they were going on the web and producing videos where they came out of the closet as undocumented, and some of them were deported on the basis of those revelations. Some of them are continued to call attention to the deportation practices. And as it became increasingly militant, they also were going into INS headquarters and turning themselves in as undocumented while webcasting the results. So when we look at the DREAM activists, we don't see weak social ties. We don't see limited risk. We see something quite different that emerged in part for the second reason that I think Gladwell is wrong, which is that he imagines Twitter as a self-contained platform. That he sort of contrasts the so-called Twitter revolutions of our current moment with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. I would argue a better comparison would be the role of the telephone in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So here we see Martin Luther King talking on a telephone. Maybe he's talking to the Kennedys. Maybe he's talking to the Freedom Riders in the North. Maybe he's talking to another Black church leader. Clearly, the telephone played a role in organizing political movements of that period, but we would never call the civil rights movement in the 1960s a telephone revolution. We would insist that the telephone was one means, one channel among many. And part of the argument I want to make today is rather than focusing on Twitter, we should focus on the full range of modes of participation, ways of engaging with politics. I want to argue that young people today are engaged in politics by any media necessary, to sort of play on Malcolm X's phrase. I also want to push back on two other kind of assumptions that often govern these discussions. The first is that distinction between digital natives and digital immigrants, both of which seem to me deeply problematic metaphors taken at face value, but also problematic in that they invite us to see a sharp divide between youth and adults. So as we look at the movements that are central to our case studies, we are finding that young people and adults are often working together in very empowering ways. So this is not about young people acting alone. It's about forming networks that allow them to participate on equal footing in very powerful roles but nevertheless in collaboration with adults who are also concerned with those issues. I also want to push back on the category of citizen journalism, which is a term that has so many problems with it that it's hard to know where to start. But in many ways, it's a term like horseless carriage that describes what's coming in terms of what has been. That the category of journalist is profoundly limiting to describe the range of activities young people are involved with when they go into media and try to mobilize behind political change. At the same time, I'd like to think that our journalists should think of themselves always as citizens. So a distinction that treats citizen as amateur, that treats the journalist as professional and so not a citizen, fails us on so many levels that I think we have to move beyond it as we think about the forms of social communication that we're observing. Last November, I was in New York for the conference that Trevor Schultz organized at the New School of Social Research, and it was the peak of Occupy Wall Street. So I wandered by their sort of stand in New York City and found as I arrived, a whole busload of zombies were pouring off. They were fans from a local horror film convention who had showed up in costume and makeup to participate in the protest. And I've since learned that zombies are one of many important metaphors that Occupy, the libertarians, that other political movements around the world are using in their political discourse. But what was happening at that moment was the zombies were getting their pictures taken. They were the front lines. Many curious people were drawn in by the zombies. People were creating cell phone footage that ended up on the web. They became just one moment in this kind of grand carnival or spectacle that Occupy represented, but they were using the language of popular culture to engage politically. If I walked deeper into the park, I would have seen the Occupy Sesame Street crowd, which similarly are appropriating and remixing characters from popular culture in order to create political messages. And in some way, what we see is Occupy was participatory politics writ large. It was not so much a movement as traditionally understood as it was a provocation for conversation, an attempt to shift discourse in a variety of ways. And as it did so, it sought to use remix practices and recirculation practices to get its message out. And I often, since then, have found myself thinking about Pepper Spray Cop, the UC Davis campus policeman who sprayed protesters, and within 48 hours was in the center of more than 200 memes and mashup footage that was circulating in the web. We've seen how effective this can be if we look at the kinds of responses to the Democratic and Republican debates that came out over the last few weeks. Binders of Women would be a classic example. These are the people's editorial cartoons, the capacity of people to mix images together in ways that enable new dramatic representations of abstract issues and they get put into circulation. This politics of circulation turns out to be global, and the image we have here is of Palestinian protesters marching through the occupied territory, painted up as Na'vi from James Cameron's Avatar, and chanting things like, "Sky people, you can't take our land." One of many, many movements around the planet which have used a rhetoric of fan appropriation and remixing to call attention to local struggles of indigenous people, of over the environment, in countries from Brazil to China to Egypt to Palestine. We're seeing these kinds of mobilizations, and they've been very effective at getting that message out and putting them into circulation. Through the work we're doing, we've also looked at sort of literal fan activists. I doubt that the Palestinians saw themselves necessarily as huge fans of Avatar, but the Harry Potter Alliance is made up of young people who are organized and are aware as fans, but are working for social change. This is a story about their struggles over a few years back over the main equal marriage proposition, which passed this past week, and that they again were out very strong, representing their houses, mobilizing and getting people to polls to vote on an issue that was important to the community. What we've seen in looking at participatory cultures is that fans are incredibly effective at learning from each other, at creating new imagery, at spreading messages, at organizing to bring about change in terms of the activities that lead to fans rallying to keep a favorite program on the air often can result in, by the time they're done with that process, they've already done everything that they would need to do an activist project. And so what the Harry Potter Alliance has done, I think, very effectively, is take the fan infrastructure, take fan logics, fan identities, and map them onto a variety of different social concerns and political causes. In the work we're doing on the Dream Activist, we see there that while the Dream Activist's primary identity is as an activist, as undocumented youth working for social change, they often find themselves drawing on rhetoric from popular culture in order to express their ideas. So last summer back, DC Comics sparked controversy because Superman was renouncing his American citizenship in a kind of parallel universe story. And many conservatives were outraged at this movement away from truth, justice, and the American way. But some of the Dream Activists were posing a provocative question: when did Superman ever become an American citizen? If ever there was an illegal alien, an undocumented youth, it was Kal-El of planet Krypton, who creeped across the border in the middle of the night, was adopted by an Anglo family, has lived in hiding and secrecy for most of his life, but nevertheless has worked as a journalist and worked to bring about a better society. And so that image of Superman as undocumented became one of many, many images that circulated through the Dream Activist movement, but became empowering because it translated political concerns into the language of popular culture and encouraged activists to think of themselves as fans. Tom Frank this past week, or a couple of weeks ago in the Baffler, has a piece where he contrasts Occupy with the Tea Party and argues that the Tea Party was far more effective because it was able to elect legislatures and translate its politics into political action, whereas he critiques the Dream Activist or critiques the Occupy for being engaged purely on a discursive level. I think after last week's elections, we might want to complicate that many of the Tea Party candidates who got elected 2 years ago have already been thrown out of office. That it's pretty easy to see that the discourse about the 99% and the 1%, the discourse about wealth inequality, contributed to the critique of Mitt Romney as a vulture capitalist that was part of the rhetoric that led to his defeat. So we have to think in a complicated way about how discursive participation and political action, traditionally understood, work together in complicated ways to reframe political issues. Here at Civic Past, we've spent a lot of time thinking about CUNY 2012, probably the most heavily circulated video of all times, a video that, and through grassroots networks, had reached 77 million viewers in under 4 days' time, which meant that it had a higher viewership than both the highest rated film in the box office that week and the highest rated program on broadcast television that week. So it opens up this question of the power of circulation, the power of grassroots spread of media content, which is a central theme of some work that I have coming out right now, and what its effects are. The two dominant critiques of this kind of movement have been, first of all, the notion of slacktivism, that as many people passed the video along and didn't necessarily take any other kind of meaningful action. So how we leverage this early phase of connection, of engagement, of circulation into kinds of participation on the ground that make a difference on issues seems like an important one. And I think one that we are going to be focusing on more and more in our research. The other critique was that as this message circulated, it was not necessarily accompanied with the opportunity to drill deeper. So it achieved what we call spreadability, the ability to travel rapidly through the internet. It lacks drillability, the ability of people to push hard to find the answers they're seeking for. And particularly what it did was the internal organization of Invisible Children sort of turned inward because of the tragedy that affected the filmmaker Jason Russell. The fans and supporters on the edges of the network found themselves exposed, unable to successfully rebut or respond to critiques, lacking the information they needed to offer critical judgments about competing truth claims being made about what was taking place in Uganda. And I think we're seeing that as one of the major challenges. It's accompanied with the statistic that came out of the YPP network's survey data, which found 85% of young people need more help, know they need more help, and assessing the quality of information they receive online. So I've thrown a few ideas here out about political participation. If you'd like to drill down deeper on some of these, we can take this well beyond the political sphere in our conversation. I wanted to flag 3 new books I have coming out right now. This week, the reissue of Textual Poachers. Coming up in January, Spreadable Media, Creating Value and Meaning in a Networked Culture, which deals with these politics of circulation, among other things. And coming out in late February, early March is Reading in a Participatory Culture, Remixing Moby Dick in the English Classroom. And finally, just if you want to drill deeper into things I've talked about specifically in this talk, article up this week called The New Political Commons. And there's a special issue of Transformative Works and Culture on fan activism, which was edited by Sangeeta and I, and by the team here at USC. So that said, I'm going to turn it back for discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Henry. I want to invite those of you in the live stream to feel free to post questions in the chat there. But first, I wanted to open it up to comment or questions from those in the Hangout here today. I think questions for Henry or members of his team, if anybody wants to jump in.
Yeah, I actually had a quick question for Henry's team to see if you can share any stories about, if you have any, of educators successfully inviting the practices of a learner's participatory culture into the classroom in a meaningful way. Sometimes I see an attempt to homogenize student interests and just assume, oh, all students love to use YouTube to share and remix, so let's bring YouTube in, and they focus really on the tool without really differentiating for what participatory culture is, that each student might have unique interests, and you fall into this trap where you just take the tool and focus on it exclusively. So I'm just wondering if you have some information or an anecdote to share where you've seen that be successful in an institution where someone has tried that.
Yeah, I think even in the classroom, as in the politics, the phrase "by any media necessary" is kind of key. That it's just as we would not want to focus our political critique only on Twitter, but should look at the full range of activities and interests that are reflected in the groups I just talked about. We don't want to choose a technology, bring it to the classroom, and assume it fits all learners. That I think that's a fundamental mistake. We've been working here in Los Angeles with a teacher training program, which we've issued some white papers that people can find through my blog that describe some of the activities we've done. And we have 2 more of those white papers coming out in the next few weeks that really describe some successful experiments in first using participatory culture practices to train teachers and get them to think about their work better. That you can't have a top-down professional development course and then assume teachers will translate that into really rich participatory activities in the classroom. We had to reimagine professional development in order to get teachers to that point of view. And then we provided a certain amount of support and hand-holding for teachers as they took this back to their classrooms. One of the things they've worked with is a platform called Playground, which we've been developing inside the Annenberg Innovation Lab, which is designed to do for culture what, say, Scratch does for programming. It's designed to be a place where people create multimedia challenges, multidisciplinary challenges that can embed media and that can be traded with other teachers and other students and can be remixed easily. We're just at the alpha state with that project, but we've got teachers using it in their classes and generated some really rich stuff around Occupy, around the Dream Activists from some of the social studies teachers, but also around the digestive tract, around very traditional school content that required students and teachers pulling their knowledge together, creating a learning environment where they learn from each other, creating a more playful environment, taking advantages the resources of the community. There's a lot we learn from that that's too much to sum up here, but these white papers actually do break it down pretty thoroughly and share a lot of the stories of the successful projects these teachers were able to do in the year and a half we were working with them.
Thank you very much. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Great.
Does anyone else want to jump in on this topic?
This is Maureen. I'm sorry, earlier I had a little bit of a jumpy issue, but do you need to address your question? Right now we're working inside the Chicago Public Schools with staff and faculty from Columbia College in Chicago, and we're using their medium of art to integrate core curriculum from Common Core to create projects that will stimulate engagement, participatory culture within the classroom, between the teaching artist and the classroom teacher, and between the artist and the students. The goal there is to engage the students not only in their core curriculum, but the tools that they're probably already using in their homes, on their cell phones, on their computers, in a more educational way. And we do have that some examples on our blog for you to check out how we are integrating that project.
So I think in my own teaching, one of the things I've discovered is the more open-ended the assignment is, the richer it is for students' participation. So Justine Cassell and I some years ago taught a children's media course where the assignment was create an artifact that's used for children and then explain the design principles that went into it. And we found we had people who did children's books and illustration, the people did design games, developed doll theaters, developed a whole range of projects using a range of different skills and production techniques. And then the learning came in demonstrating their analysis. This is something Dan Hickey in the participatory assessment group talks about, that in the classroom we assess the thinking process, not necessarily the production process, but that we create a chance for students to try out new things, or bring existing skills that they might use in their lives outside of schools into the classroom, and really in creative ways. And that's an open-ended assignment that's not based on a single tool or a single practice that I think paves the way for richer kinds of participation. I think we see the same thing if we look at a group like the Harry Potter Alliance, right? That there are many ways of involving yourself in that group, many forms of media production, social networking, social organizing that are needed for that. And that group, because it's got both a kind of central charismatic leadership coupled with an open-ended participatory structure and the capacity for any hub of the network to be able to initiate a new project, it may well be in one community the most pressing issue is veterans' rights. In another community, it may be equal marriage, and the structure has been there to facilitate mobilization around a variety of different issues.
So to just dovetail on that really quickly, Netta and I actually pulled together an analysis of how learning happens within the HPA, the Harry Potter Alliance, and Invisible Children, and that paper is now also available. And we were really looking at how these organizations couple informal and more formal learning opportunities to encourage practice-based learning. And it's exactly what Henry said, in the sense that you learn on the task, but then we also identify certain areas that the organization is privileged for learning that maybe we hadn't thought of. I mean, we were really surprised how strongly, for example, storytelling came up as a practice that was important for people to learn to participate in these groups, or that was something that they really valued within the groups. So I will also post a link to that paper as well.
Great, thanks for sharing all those resources. I have a question from the live stream from Barry Joseph. This is a question for Henry. Henry, when you first published the white paper, the new Media Literacies white paper, I presume, you wrote, quote, "The greatest opportunities for change are found in after-school programs and informal learning communities," end quote. 6 years later, in what ways has the landscape changed, if at all?
Well, it's an interesting one. I still think that the greatest opportunities are outside of school. You know, I've certainly heard some of my colleagues like Jim G say we should just blow up the schools and start over. And I don't believe that's a viable option. I think we owe it to teachers to be there to support them, to help them work through schools. But it's a harder battle than frankly, to change the structure of education. When you're working for the state, when you're part of regimented national curriculums and standardized testing, than it is to create very locally specific on-the-ground activities through something like the U Media Centers at Chicago, or if you're creating an organization like the Harry Potter Alliance or the Nerd Fighters or so forth, that I think each of those offer much more flexibility and fluidity. I think Global Kids, where Barry Joseph has long been associated, has done really innovative work at, you know, with the ever-shifting toolkit and ever-shifting set of curriculum priorities, working with very different kinds of kids, to make a difference. And so I think then as now, the informal space is better. Now, where we've made progress is a claim that I make both in the white paper and in Convergence Culture, where I say that we are learning through play skills that we will apply to other purposes later. And I think the shift that I'm trying to document with the Civic Paths work is that shift from kinds of fan engagements that Convergence Culture wrote about when I was writing a book 8 years ago, that some of which we hinted at in that book were moving toward politics, to a much more fully developed system of civic participation that's emerged, both through the emergence of fan activist organizations, but also through the grassroots production of memes and circulation of memes that we've seen in the last election, through movements like Occupy, through the effective use of YouTube by a variety of the groups in our case studies. We're seeing that this stuff that people may have learned how to make movies recording skateboarding, and now they're recording protests, that I think that's a huge shift in terms of the ways we're able to act politically in this environment.
Great, thanks, Henry. It looks like we have Andy back. Andy, did you want to jump in with a question? I saw that you were typing on the live stream.
Yeah, I'm curious about what we do with these students that aren't so digitally native, that they might be, younger, and their counterparts might be very savvy with technology and using all these different tools online. But what do we do with the students who are at a disadvantage because they don't have experiences with technology like their peers do? Are we going to end up having teachers having lessons on how to use Twitter and how to Google things? I'm just curious, Henry, what you have to say about that.
Well, my philosophy has always been that you should focus on the conceptual and social skills, the cultural competencies of the level that I described in the white paper, more than specific technical skills. Because for one thing, the technical skills are going to change fairly dramatically year for year. But for another, it allows us to focus on schools that don't have one laptop per child, and students who haven't necessarily had access to digital technology outside of the classroom. It clearly is a priority to give them exposure to new media tools and practices, but it may be an even bigger priority to give them opportunities to practice remix in a critical way, to think about visualizations and simulations, to think about collective intelligence and distributed cognition. Those skills are larger than technologies. This came into play when Laurel Felt, one of my PhD candidates here at USC, taught a course one summer in Senegal, where she was going to teach a course on new media literacies, and she arrived and the town's generator went down and didn't get back up until she left. So she has an entire summer to work with students to think about new media learning, and got no access to any kinds of electrically powered technologies whatsoever. And she was able to still build on activities we developed that are focused on acquiring the social and cultural skills that can be put to use in a digital environment. I think this is also an implication of this shift from the digital generation to the transmedia generation. The transmedia notion of by any medium necessary allows us to say we can do low-tech things. We could do a transmedia experience that involves street art and oral storytelling and live music and dance, that doesn't require technology, but does require an understanding of networks, of multimodalities, and so forth. Or we can do something that's very high tech. But learning those skills and tapping into the resources and knowledge and capacities of the entire population paves the way for both learning and civic participation in very powerful ways.
I had another quick question, if you don't mind me jumping in. I think right now there's this, somewhat spoken, somewhat unspoken quid pro quo where students get free access to these amazing tools, and in exchange, their personal data is used for financial gain of major organizations. And I'm just wondering if that ever comes up when you and the other members of your group discuss it. Is this an equitable trade? You know, are these some things that we should be discussing moving forward, or just kind of seeing how that has bubbled up in your conversations?
Well, this is probably one of the most important issues of our time in a certain way. And I start by making a distinction between Web 2.0, which is a business model, and participatory culture, which is a much longer struggle for access to the communicative capacity, for the tools for cultural production and circulation. So right now, the platforms that support participatory culture most powerfully are Web 2.0 platforms. But the Web 2.0 rhetoric assumes that there is an easy match between the interest of consumers and companies. And in fact, what we're seeing is every Web 2.0 platform is in the center of ongoing struggles over the terms of our participation. And so anytime we teach students participatory culture, we should be teaching them a critical understanding of the context they're participating in. So in the course that I teach here at USC, I work hard both to get students to think underneath the hood about how Wikipedia works, but also to look at terms of services, to look at curatorial policies, to look at a number of things that affect their use of these platforms. So my position is never just a celebration of the platforms, but a recognition that the affordances of those platforms have been a step forward over existing media systems that allow this kind of participatory culture to grow. And I think the most powerful groups are those that continually question their own routines. So I was impressed, the Occupy movement has used the Guy Fawkes mask as a very powerful tool for protest, but quite rapidly they began to call attention to the fact that the rights to Guy Fawkes mask in the United States are run by Warner Brothers, so that every Occupy protester who wears that mask is paying money into the system. Or the Harry Potter Alliance and Not in Harry's Name has been leveraged their status as Harry Potter fans to call out the Warner Brothers contracts to chocolate manufacturers around the world where they're not using fair trade practices. So this is a matter of getting inside the platform, use its affordances, and then challenge the policies that restrict participation or that commodify participation in powerful ways. So a lot of the book Spreadable Media that's coming out in January talks about this kind of debate and struggle. That's another of the changes over the 6 years since both the white paper and convergence culture came out, is that we do have much deeper understanding of the contradictions of what it is to deal with Web 2.0 companies.
Henry, I have a question from live stream and Twitter, which is also on this question maybe about the contradictions and what we should support. So you mentioned slacktivism in your talk. The question is, should we bother with slacktivism? Is there a value in it? You know, liking a video about a faraway place?
Well, I do think it's important. I think that there's an opportunity now for people to place issues on the national and international agenda through bottom-up networks that really shouldn't be sneered at, right? So whatever we think about the specific content of CUNY 2012, the specific politics and policies it embodied, it put Africa on the op-ed pages of newspapers around the country, got young people asking questions about Africa, and paved the way for other kinds of conversations to take place. That obviously it reached greater circulation in a given piece that was followed up on it, but in a context where we have a much increasingly porous global media landscape, lots of African voices responded to CUNY 2012, were circulated through YouTube, did get seen. So I think, first of all, its top impact is discursive, of creating awareness, creating engagement. The second thing is that research shows that when young people involve themselves in these kind of small-scale social media actions, they are more likely to take the next step. They're more likely to contribute money, time, energy to an actual campaign. And so it's a kind of incremental step model that research would suggest. Same way that if you're trying to get a contribution from someone, you know, you start with a small ask and you ramp up to bigger engagements with your community. The third thing I'd say is CUNY 2012 was not simply something that took place online, that this group had built local clubs, local chapters over a 10-year period of time which meant that there was a lot of activity on the ground, not just on the airwaves, but it involved far fewer people. And the final point is that if we look at the discursive, even with the controversy and pushback CUNY 2012 got, they started out thinking that they were going to reach 500,000 people over 2 months. They got 77 million people over 4 days. The next video that came out showed a major dip. It reached about 2 million people over the first week. But if we read 2 million against 77 million, it looks small. If we read 2 million against 500,000, it looks like a significant gain. And so even if we think of CUNY 2012 as largely a failure to achieve its goals, it built the base. It dramatically expanded the base for whatever Invisible Children tries to do next. And I think also got young people connected to the political process in ways that they had not been before. So I would say, yes, slacktivism matters. I would defend slacktivism, but I would say we want to push beyond it always. And the groups that we're studying all have really rich mechanisms for doing that.
I think you just coined a new term, Henry, slacktivism.
Yeah, sorry about that, but it's not a bad one.
Yeah, it's not a bad one. Jen, did you want to jump in? I know you've done research in this area.
Yeah, I think I would go maybe a little farther than Henry went in trying to defend concerns about slacktivism, in the sense that I think there are moments where what people do online in relatively ephemeral engagements can still nonetheless matter a lot and have big impacts. So I think it's kind of important to step back from this question and think a little more deeply about how political engagement often happens. So as a social movement scholar, I'll tell you that one thing that all my colleagues in social movement studies can agree on is that what we have a problem explaining is participation. So most people who agree with an idea aren't going to do anything about that. And so we're often looking at social movement participation as something that is, one out of thousands or tens of thousands of people who believe in a particular position are actually going to take an action about that. And so I think a lot of people poo-poo slacktivism out of the thought that a sort of glass half full, glass half empty, that these were folks who, but for the opportunity to do something lesser than slacktivism, would have engaged in much more serious action. And I think it's actually quite the opposite. But for a low-cost opportunity to engage in a political expression, they would have foregone that political expression. And so I think instead of thinking about this as 7 million people who didn't do as much as they could have, it's 7 million people who did something that no one thought they would have, which is, I think the conversation, for instance, around the CUNY 2012 video, that it's odd that we're not talking about how amazing it is that we could get 7 million people to even be ephemerally interested in Africa and the United States, versus whether it's such a shame that those 7 million people haven't become some new army for activism around African politics. So I think we need to step back a little bit and say, well, what we really know is that people often do nothing even when they agree on a position. And so if we can move them to doing something, are there times where that can be quite effective? And I think that there are, for instance, times where early research is showing that that can be quite effective. So for instance, if you're trying to change something like racism, is slacktivism going to have a big role in that? Probably not, but honestly, the civil rights movement isn't solving that after 30 years either. So you're not exactly comparing apples to apples. But if you want to affect a specific time limited decision, the city council is voting on Thursday about X. Can an online petition with tens of thousands of signatures do a lot to sway that vote? Most certainly it can. And so I think we sort of need to move away from this argument about that Gladwell is kind of implicitly making about some kinds of activism not mattering because they're not the same as what we're used to looking at, and instead think about under what conditions can moving people to do something actually be quite important, and with the realization that we can move a lot more people to do something than we can move people to do classic traditional forms of engagement.
Those are great points, Jen. I'm wondering, to jump off that, Liana or Netta, you sort of have your feet on the ground with young people and how engagement is working with them. If you want to jump in on any of these issues.
This is Netta. So one thing I can say, and this may continue on the Coney 2012 point and also connecting to young people. So this is based on some research that Sangeeta and I mostly did around invisible children in earlier stages of our research. One thing that we talk about is how Invisible Children was very successful in reaching young people and mobilizing young people, and so that things that seem to older audiences sometimes as tasteless or just not the way that they would do things, maybe sometimes the very things that do speak to young people. And we think that one of the powerful things that IC did was really give young people the sense that they have a voice, that their participation matters. That what they can do can affect change. And this is where young people often feel that they don't have a voice, that nothing that they can do will make a change. And so that was really something that was very powerful. And I think that we saw an example of that even now in the last election, where the youth vote again was really something that was mobilized, and we saw that in turnout, where youth turnout was again high and not low like we saw in previous elections where the youth vote wasn't mobilized as much.
I'm just going to, before Leanna, I wanted to just jump in and sort of point to the fact that Invisible Children is also still around. That it's, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. That the Invisible Children is still around, and in fact, this Saturday they're having a rally in Washington D.C. where they're asking all of their members to go to D.C. And I just checked their sites, and they actually have, according to their website, they have 10,000 people registered to show up in D.C. this weekend, where they're going to rally, and then they're going to have a big dance party to arrest Joseph Kony. So I just think, sort of going back to Jen's point, I think it's really interesting to think about the numbers involved and the kind of involvement that has been asked of Invisible Children members across all of these examples, ranging from the long-term members that Netta and I looked at before, all the way through to Coney 2012, now to this Move DC event that they're planning this weekend.
Great, thanks, Sangeeta and Netta. So, Leanna, I know you've been working on a really interesting case of youth mobilization that I think people would be interested in hearing about. And again, it's not exactly in the fan activism space, but definitely an interesting case of linking up some of the more youth-centered engagement with political engagement.
Sure. So I'm actually studying young libertarians, and yeah, okay. I'm studying young libertarians, and an interesting finding that I've come across is actually that when I first started the case study, I thought that young libertarians would be voting for the Libertarian Party candidate or voting for Ron Paul, but in fact, many of them are categorical non-voters, and they use other means, so these discursive means that we're talking about, to affect change. So a lot of the folks that I talked to consider themselves to be little L libertarians, which means that they're more interested in educating their peers through, be it through making a music video about their favorite theorist, or passing on a meme on Facebook, or having a debate on Facebook, to really change public opinion and change people's minds rather than voting. So that group of people has sort of given up on the electoral process altogether. They're given up on institutional politics, and so they really use these other mechanisms that we're talking about to affect change, and they feel like, Netta was talking about with Coney 2012, it's important because it gave young people sort of this feeling that they have a voice and that they have the ability to make a difference. And so the group that I'm looking at really has invested wholeheartedly and just put sort of everything they have in this model of change, and this participatory model of change versus the electoral model of change. And so I'm kind of trying to think through how that process speaks to electoral politics as well. Does that answer kind of what you're looking for, Mimi?
Yeah, no, I think it's just fantastic how Henry and the team at USC have really been challenging us to expand our imagination about what counts as civic and political engagement. And I think Jen's comments have been really tremendously helpful in framing that from a different sort of research angle. And, you know, I loved having this conversation also about the links to education because I think with this expanded imagination of what counts as youth, civic and political engagement, we also have an expanded opportunity for considering ways in which we expand and reach out to youth in both formal and informal educational contexts. So it's been great to have educators as part of this conversation as well. We're getting pretty close to the top of the hour, so I just wanted to invite the Hangout participants if somebody had a burning comment that they wanted to make before we close, and I'll give it to Sangeeta and Henry for final words.
I'll pass it to Henry for final words.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting anyone else off. So yeah, I think the connection Mimi just made to schools is a crucial one as we think about this. If you read a report like the Civic Mission of Schools, it makes a fairly strong and compelling case that young people tend to be socialized into political participation through after-school programs and extracurricular activities, but also through engagement with student government, through engagement with civic classrooms and social science classrooms where teachers bring in current events. This is the classic model of what civic engagement looks like, how it comes about. And when we know that by the time they reach a certain age, young people either have become political or they're less likely to in the course of the rest of their lives. So this is a crucial moment in their lives. We're finding that the fan activism and the other kinds of youth networks that we've been looking at are offering another model of socialization, another point of entry, where kids who are culturally participating find their way into political participation. But the power of a connected learning model is that we can connect those two things together. That the Civic Mission of Schools report sort of suggests that where students have a chance to enact participation in politically meaningful ways and making decisions, that's the most powerful model. But it says schools often have not been able to hold on to youth-driven political activity in the school, that they're resistant to it, that young voices are shut down at school. So if we can leverage the outside school environments where young people are guild leaders in World of Warcraft, or running petitions through their fan organizations, or participating in CUNY 2012 or whatever, and connect that back to the discussions that could take place in the classroom that provide context, that provide information around it, then we potentially have a very powerful version of what connected learning might look like.
Great, thanks so much, Henry. So I wanted to thank Henry and also everybody who participated on our Hangout today for a really fantastic conversation. For all of you who tuned in on the live stream as well as the group here on the Hangout, we really encourage you to continue the conversation through the Twitter hashtag Connected Learning. Also, we have comments on our webinar page. This webinar will be archived. There will be a full recording on the connectedlearning.tv page later today. The next Connected Learning webinar will be next Tuesday, November 20th at 10 Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. We will speak with Zach Malamud and Allison Wu about the importance of student voice in education reform. Thanks for joining us, everybody.